from Matthew chapter 8, verses 18 through 22. Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. And the scribe came up and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Another of the disciples said to him, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." And Jesus said to him, "Follow me, and leave the dead to bury their own dead."
Good morning.
Morning.
Hope you all are doing well today. It's a beautiful day with great weather. Came out and I thought it was going to be a little bit cold, but then the sun was shining and it felt really good. We're on the fourth part of our series called The Authority of Jesus. It takes place basically right after Jesus came down the mountain after preaching the Sermon on the Mount. And right after that, what we find is that there are two groups of three miracles that Jesus did. And right in the middle of it, we have this scene that we just read about in our scripture reading. Before we get into that, though, I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story from my own life of how I went from just believing in Jesus to actually following him. Back in the year of our Lord, 1987, I was living in a small town in Kansas. I was 7 years old, and the pastor did an altar call, and I went up to the front of the church, and I told the pastor that I wanted to be baptized. And of course, you know, this was a First Baptist church, and so they were all about that. And within a week, I had gone through all the classes for baptism that they had set up, and I was baptized. So I was baptized at the age of 7. But it was not until many years later that I actually started following Jesus wholeheartedly. Not until, in fact, I was 25 years old in the year 2005. Many years later. And at that time in my life, the Lord basically, He took everything away from me, made me realize that I needed to rely on Him. And I came to a point where I basically had to make this decision about how much Jesus is really worth to me. How valuable is He to me? Is he valuable enough that I just believe in Him, or is He valuable enough that I'm actually going to put Him above anything else in my life? That's the decision I had to come to. And so that's the big question that we're going to be thinking about this morning. How much is Jesus worth to you? How much is Jesus worth to you? Because at some point, all of us have to go through this, we have to answer this question. We have to decide, am I actually going to put Jesus above everything else in my life? And that's what happens with these two people that Jesus met on the road that were read in the passage today. He met two would-be followers, and Jesus challenged both of them to decide if following Him was going to be worth the cost to their lives. That's why I'm talking about value here. Is Jesus more valuable than these other things that they're going to lose by following Him? Or is He not? And they have to decide that. So we're not told in this passage what either of them decided to do. Instead, we're left with this question ringing in our ears. Is Jesus worth that much to me? So he has two conversations, and two challenges in those conversations emerge that help us understand what it really means to value Jesus over other things. Because the fact is, to be a Christian, to follow Jesus, you must value Him above everything else. So two conversations and two challenges. The first challenge we find in verses 19 and 20, but I'll go ahead and read verse 18 as well. Now when Jesus saw a crowd around Him, He gave orders to go over to the other side. Notice here, Jesus is giving orders. He does that. Jesus is in authority here. And people are obeying his orders, at least because they have some understanding of his authority. Verse 19, and a scribe came up and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So here we are. We're on the western side of the Sea of Galilee in Capernaum, just after Peter's house, where his mother-in-law was. Okay, now they're moving over here. They're about to cross over to the other side. And while Jesus is calling for that, giving the orders to do that, that's when this person comes up to him, this scribe, this person whose job it is to basically copy the texts of Scripture in the temple. And he recognized Jesus' authority, and at least initially, he's responded in faith to Jesus, right? He's come up to Jesus and said, I want to follow you. I want to follow you. I think maybe that's where I was when I was 7 years old. Hey, I want to be a Christian. I want to believe. But I didn't have any understanding at that time of what the challenges of following Jesus actually were. So this man comes up to Jesus in the same way. I think he doesn't have any idea what this would mean for his life. He boldly proclaims, I'll follow you wherever you go. And so Jesus responds to him in a way that challenges him. He says, he talks about foxes and birds and nests and holes. Okay, what's that all about? Well, these are the homes of birds and foxes, right? Foxes live in holes, birds live in nests. And as those are their homes, they're also places of safety and comfort. And so what Jesus is doing here, he's highlighting a contrast here. He says that the comfort and safety of foxes and birds in their homes are the kind of thing that you're probably not going to get with me. So he makes this contrast. Places of safety and comfort, but I don't have something like that right now. So Jesus contrasts their homes with his own lack of a home. I think he was speaking here directly to the major obstacle of this man that he had from following Jesus. Jesus does that everywhere you look. Whenever he meets somebody, he speaks directly to the thing that is holding them back from following him, holding them back from believing in him. Sometimes people will ask him a question and he'll answer with something that seems completely unrelated, but you find out later, oh, okay, he actually saw the question behind the question. In this case, he says to this man, look, you probably won't have a home with me, at least not yet. And so the first challenge that we extract from this is that Christians must value Jesus above our own comfort and safety. We must value Jesus above our own comfort and safety. So Jesus says, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He's talking about himself. And it makes me think of that servant song in Isaiah that we talked a little bit about last week, that Matthew actually put his this part of the story in the context of. We find in that servant song, it says the Messiah is going to be rejected by his own people. And so that essentially makes him homeless. He's rejected by his own people. And I think that's partly what's in view here. Because those who reject Jesus are also going to reject the people of Jesus. Everyone who follows Jesus, in a sense, becomes homeless as we slowly conform more and more to Jesus and are therefore conforming, well, I don't know what the opposite of conform is, but moving further and further away from our home culture. We conform to him rather than to the culture of our world. And what happens then is that people in the culture of our world begin to understand us less and less. And eventually it's possible that our safety nets and the supporting communities that we had might disappear as we follow Jesus more closely. There's a great risk then in following Jesus. And we have to ask ourselves, is Jesus worth that much to me? Is Jesus worth that much to you? The closer we follow Jesus, the more into conflict we will come with the culture of our world. And in a sense, then we also become homeless. But the great thing about giving up your home to follow Jesus is that you gain a much better one. Jesus had no place to lay his head then, but there will be a day when he returns, when Jesus comes back, and he brings his kingdom with him. And in that day, Jesus will be home, and we consequently, if we're following Jesus, we will be home too. So we're looking forward to a much, much better home. And so following Jesus then means being a sojourner on our way home. When I was young, just a couple of years after I was baptized, I was about 9 years old, we made a big move. We moved from the middle of Kansas, a town of about 2,000 people. We moved from Kansas to Tucson, Arizona. And we drove there. And we had this big truck that my dad used to call Lucy May. And we packed everything into that big truck. I don't know why he called the truck that, but that was the truck's name. We packed everything into this big truck. And we drove all the way across the country to get to our new home in Arizona. Well, as we were on that journey, we had to sacrifice a lot of the comforts that we would normally have in our home as we travel to our new home. And I think that's kind of where we are as Christians. Our home is God's kingdom. And so while we're here, we're actually passing through these places here on our way to God's kingdom. And so if that's the case, we're looking forward to a better home over there, then we can give up the comfort and safety now as we follow Jesus, because we're looking forward to ultimate comfort and safety in his kingdom. When it comes down to it, I think a lot of us in here have probably a better sense of what it means to be homeless than some others do. People who stay in one place for their whole lives. I don't know how many times you guys have moved. I've talked to a few of you, and I know that you guys have, at least a lot of you here today, Korea is not your first home. You know what it is to move and to leave everything behind. You know how you sort of drop off the context of your old place as you put on the context of the new place. And that's what we're doing as Christians, really, too. We take off the context of our old life as we follow Jesus, and we put on the new one. So valuing Jesus above the comfort and safety of a normal, culture-conformed life, I think demonstrates that we are on our way to that new home in Jesus' kingdom. Now, let's stop there for just a second, because deciding to no longer conform to the ways of our culture is definitely not an easy thing to do. It's really, really hard. It's really hard, especially when we have relationships that are still in that old way of living. And the relationships we have with those people, they have expectations of us. But we can't do those things anymore because we're trying to follow Jesus. And that's what happens to the next person that Jesus talks to. In verses 21 and 22, this is the next challenge. It says, another disciple said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. So we have a disciple here who also, at least initially, responds to Jesus with faith. And again, we don't know what he decided to do after that. We're just sort of left with this question, what would I do there? What would I do in this situation? This person needed to make the transition from believing in Jesus to actually obeying him, to actually following him. And so what he says to Jesus, he says, let me first bury my father. Okay, so let's pause there for a second, because I don't think his father was actually dead. I think what's actually going on here is that we're looking at a pretty common expression from the Middle East. And it's still an expression that's still around today. Okay, it's basically, it's an expression of fulfilling your duties, your obligations to your family. If you guys are familiar with the term filial piety, it's the idea that you have to honor and respect especially your parents, which is actually a biblical idea as well, that we honor our father and our mother, right? It's there. But in a society where filial piety is a high value, it's actually a good son who postpones his own ambitions in order to respect what his parents want him to do first. And so that's the frame of mind this person is thinking in. He's saying, well, I can't follow you right now, Jesus, because I need to fulfill all of my obligations to my family, particularly my father, before I do that. That might take a very, very long time. In fact, this is an almost indefinite postponement of following Jesus until his father dies. Basically, the relationship is, or the obligations are settled in a very, very natural way. So he wanted to wait until all of his family obligations naturally came to an end before following Jesus. Jesus' answer is pretty shocking, though perhaps not in the way that we might initially imagine. He starts by commanding the man. He says, "Follow me." It's a command. And so then the question becomes a matter of which authority this man values more. Does he value the authority of his father more, or does he value the authority of Jesus more? And he has to make that decision. Going back to that servant song in Isaiah, there's this part where it says, "We esteemed him not." Basically, we saw this Messiah figure, and we did not value him the way that we were supposed to. In other words, people fail to properly estimate the value and the authority of Jesus. And so we think it's okay to postpone or even fail completely to obey him. Especially when obedience to Jesus gets in the way of an important relationship. We have to decide. We look at Jesus and we say, well, is it Jesus or is it my friends? Is it Jesus or is it my boyfriend or girlfriend? Is it Jesus or is it my parents? Is it Jesus or is it my brothers and sisters? So the challenge for us is that Christians must value Jesus above even their closest relationships. Jesus suffered and died to take away the grief, the sin, the disease, etc. of his people. And so as people we have to recognize the weight of our redemption. What Jesus has actually accomplished for us. And because of that, we need to value our Redeemer above everything else. Jesus expects us to make following him our highest and most urgent priority. Not something that we can put off. Not something that we can say, well, I have to fulfill this obligation first and then I can follow you. Or let me keep doing this one thing for right now and then I'll stop that later and then I'll follow you. Because that's what Jesus expected of this man back then. Even above his closest relationships, his most culturally important obligations, he needed to value Jesus. And so the question then is left hanging in this passage. What did he do? What would I do? Is Jesus worth that much to me? Family, of course, is very important. God made families. And we definitely need to take care of our families. We're commanded in the Bible to honor our father and our mother. And so there's a very important detail in this text that is very that helps us clarify all of this. Jesus said, let the dead bury their own dead. It sounds harsh, but it's actually a statement of the reality of that situation. You see, when Jesus talks about the dead, he's talking about everyone who remains apart from him. Everyone who has not believed in him. We talked about this last week, that apart from Christ, we're dying both physically and spiritually. And so that's what Jesus is talking about here. Look, this disciple's father, as well as all of our loved ones who don't know Jesus, are currently dead in their sins. And they can only be saved by putting their faith in Jesus. So in that case, we have to think, well, what's the priority? What's the highest priority here? Well, the highest priority then is I need to put my trust in Jesus. I need to trust in him. I need to follow him. And as I'm following him, what's general order number 1 of the church? Go into all the world, make disciples of all nations, preach, baptize, teach. That's who we are. That's what we do as a church. And so, if I'm looking at these relationships that I have, where the people don't know Jesus, the first priority for me is to follow Jesus and obey his commands. And as I'm doing that, I'm also going to be witnessing the gospel to these people who don't know him, these people that I love. And maybe by God's grace, they'll come into the kingdom as I have. So it's very important here, I think, that the man's father was not a believer. Because as an unbeliever, the expectations of his father were absolutely going to come into conflict with Jesus' expectations of that man. So this is the direct application. We all have family and friends, etc., who do not believe in Jesus. And their expectations of us will definitely come into conflict with our obedience of Jesus. And so we have to then choose. We have to say, am I going to honor Christ? Or am I going to honor this person? Who is more valuable to us? I know this is easier said than done. I'm not standing outside of the situation. I live inside of the world too. I also have brothers who don't know the Lord. I have relatives who don't know the Lord. I have friends who don't know the Lord. The best thing that I can do for any of them is to choose Jesus and preach the gospel. So let's bring this home today. Both of the people that Jesus met, at least initially, had a positive response to Jesus. They both said that they were going to follow him. But both of them were also being held back. They were anchored in the world by something that was preventing them from following through on that response. We don't know what they chose to do. So what will you choose to do today? Home and family are the most valuable things, I think, that most of us can think of. And so when both of these things are sort of held together in this passage, and Jesus basically demands a level of value, that we should value him above the most important things that we can even think of. You know, he's really making another God-sized claim there, isn't he? You go back into the Old Testament, and what is the first command of God to the people of Israel? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Above everything else, with your whole being, you love God. And so then Jesus comes, and he's telling these people that came up and talked to him, look, you have to And so what we find is that to follow Jesus, we need to value him above everything else in our lives. So then we have to bring the question back. What is it that anchors and holds you back from really following Jesus? What is it in your life that you're placing at a higher value than following Jesus? For me, when I was in my early 20s, well, it was a lot of things. It was living my own way. It was having fun. It was, I'm going to be a rich, self-made man. These were the kinds of things that, in my mind, were more valuable. It was more valuable in my mind to become a rich, self-made man than it was to follow Jesus. It was more valuable in my mind to go out and party with my friends than to follow Jesus. But I can tell you, without even a hint of regret, that following Jesus has given me such freedom, that I have gained so much more following him than I ever could have lost. It's just like that parable Jesus told. He told a parable about a man who walks through a field and he trips on something. And he looks down and he finds that, wow, there's the most valuable treasure I've ever seen in my life. I'm going to be an extremely rich man if I can keep this. And so what's he do? It's such an interesting parable. He buries it again. And he goes out, very, very happily. It says, in his joy, he sells everything that he has, and he buys that field. I wonder what people around this man were thinking. What are you doing? Why are you selling everything you have? And why are you doing it with a big smile on your face? He does that. He buys this field, and he goes in, and he gets this treasure. And Jesus said, that's what my kingdom is like. Once you understand who Jesus really is, once you realize how valuable he is, and how great his kingdom is going to be, then we can leave even our home and our family with joy to pursue Jesus. So, what is holding us back? Jesus claimed that his death and his resurrection cancel out the penalty of our sin if we believe in him. He proved his authority in many ways. So once we believe, we also then have a responsibility to follow him and to obey him. This is definitely going to bring us into conflict with our culture and even our closest relationships. And so the big question for us then is, how much is Jesus worth to me? Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you so much that you came into this world. We thank you so much that you taught us, that you healed people's diseases and sicknesses, you cast out the demons. We thank you so much that you died on the cross, completely absorbing all the penalty of our sin. We thank you so much that you came back to life again to prove to us that the payment is complete. Lord, I pray that each one of us, every day, as we walk through life, would be able to see your surpassing worth, your great value, and choose you over anything else that might turn us away. Lord, help us to be wholehearted followers. We pray these things in Jesus' name. At this time, we're going to continue our worship with the celebration of the Lord's Supper. So if you would like to celebrate that with us, and you've believed in Jesus, then you are more than welcome to. This is also a time for us to pray together, so we're going to have a couple of people over in the corner over here who are